Namaste. Welcome everybody to this evening's discussion on the Bhagavad Gita. This evening we're going to pick up where we left off last week, which is in chapter 3, and we're going to begin with stanza number 16. But in order for us to understand, and we must know the context in which this stanza begins, so I'd like to back up one and cover a little bit of what may have been covered a little bit last week, but it'll give us a sense of what the next stanzas are referring to. And this is chapter 3, stanza number 15. And Krishna is speaking. And he says, "Know this divine vibratory activity to have been produced by Brahma, the cosmic creative force. Yajna, or sacrificial self-offering, brings the great cycle of cosmic manifestation back at last to itself." Now, what he's saying here, of course, is when he refers to the divine vibratory activity, of course, he's speaking about Om. And this Om is the creative force from which this whole universe has manifested. It was that force that manifested this universe, and it's part and parcel of the divine itself. It's that aspect of the divine that creates. And then he references here to Yajna, or sacrificial self-offering, brings the great cycle of cosmic manifestation back at last unto itself. And if you think of this, this great cycle of creation, days of Brahma, where creation goes out into manifestation, incomprehensible amounts of time. Souls are spewed out into this creation, and eventually all of those souls, all creation is one day withdrawn back into itself in the night of Brahma. And then once again, out it goes and back, repeatedly, over and over again. Someone once asked Paramahansa Yogananda, "Is there any end to it?" And he said, no end, only endlessness. Now think what that might mean, only endlessness. But the souls that go out, for them, they reach that point where they find the purpose of this creation is for the realization of each individual soul that has been spewed out into creation to awaken to its divine reality and come back into its home in God. Now, when I first heard that, I thought, well, does that mean if there's no end to this creative process, does it mean that once I find God, that ultimately I'll have to be thrown out and have to do it all over again? And if you contemplate that, it's a little bit discouraging. But Yogananda said, no, that's not the case. Once a soul has regained its place back in the divine, no more. It's the story, you might say, at that point is over. But he even said, though, there are many souls, they are cast out into creation. They don't find their way back, even in one day of Brahma. And it's again, when another creative day of Brahma is spewed out, those souls too must go again and again. And why is that? Well, it comes down to the next reading, which is, if we take it from there, the next one would be stanza 16. He says, "Whoever resists this great rotating cycle, living in sin and preferring the ego-centered enjoyment of the senses, lives in vain." In other words, it says, oh, those who resist. In other words, this cycle that is very natural. It's the purpose of creation to go out. If you resist that, ultimately you live in vain. And when he says living in vain, of course, you might think of it in terms of that saying that people have vain hopes, meaning people have hopes for happiness, hopes to find fulfillment in this or that, but they're never completed. One never finds what one is looking for when one goes looking for their happiness outside of oneself. In a sense, we're resisting the natural process of souls going out and ultimately being recalled back into God. This is a very cosmic question, and it always comes up of why in the world do we have this creation in the first place? What's the purpose of all this? And I suspect many of you have asked herself that. It's a natural question for the devotee to ask themselves, why? Why is it? And of course, there are many philosophical answers to that. It's God's play, God's lila, God enjoying himself through many. But Swami Kriyananda had a very nice way of saying that. He says the very nature of God, one of the aspects of God, of course, is Ananda, Sat Chit Ananda. And this Ananda, this bliss, the very nature of bliss is to expand. It's expansive, it's ever new. And it's also the very nature of bliss is to share. Is in a sense, it wants to not contain that bliss, and you'll see this for yourself. When you feel a sense of joy, you don't want to contain it for yourself. You want to expand and you want to share it with others. And so in the same cosmic sense, bliss is something that naturally wants to be shared. And so that definition of God creates so that he might share this bliss with all, that we might all enjoy it, or each soul enjoys it. God enjoys it through the creation of many individual souls going out and ultimately finding their true home, their back in God himself. But we resist, and for some reason, why? Why is it that people resist? We go out into creation, and if our home truly is in God, why is it that we choose, you might say, to indulge yourself in suffering, to be able to choose to wander when our true nature is bliss? Well, this too is a very cosmic question, and I was always heartened by the story that had been told of Paramahansa Yogananda, how when he was pondering these questions, it said that he argued with Divine Mother. Divine Mother, why did you create this world? Why did you create this? You created us, so it's your responsibility to free us. Why did you throw us into this world of suffering? And we had no choice in the matter, and you were the one that created us, so you must release us. And there was a story of him once he was in a state of samadhi at a group meditation, and he began to speak to Divine Mother, and he was in a state of divine ecstasy, and he was talking to Divine Mother, and he said, Mother, now I know, now I see why you have done this. And of course, it's not something that you could explain in words, but he had that intuitive perception in divine ecstasy where it all, of course, made sense. Now, I suspect much of this, he was doing it for the devotees' benefit, to be able to, play this role out so that the devotees themselves would be inspired. But there is a divine purpose for it. And you could say the spiritual path is calling us in our own soul, that question that we have of why, Mother, why God, did you create that? That question itself is calling us to seek an answer. I remember just just very shortly yesterday, a few days ago, Nayaswami Jaya was telling a story of Swami Kriyananda that somebody was very discouraged, and they were expressing their discouragement to Swamiji, and they revered Swamiji and looked up very highly to him, and they were saying, that he had seemingly accomplished quite a bit, and not to speak of what Paramahansa Yogananda, the great master that he was. And when you put yourself next to somebody of great spiritual attainment, you naturally sometimes can feel short or small next to that. And so he was looking up to Swamiji and looking up to Master, and he was feeling discouraged, because how is it possible that I could ever attain that which you have attained? And you see yourself and you see your faults, and this is what he was doing. And Swamiji very kindly said to him, he says, don't be discouraged. If it seems like I have attained something that maybe is a little bit more than yourself yet having to be able to attain, maybe it's just because I've been trying to do it a little bit longer than you have. Ultimately, in the end, we all must come to God. All of us eventually find our freedom in God. And this is something to keep in mind. We all have the destiny to find our freedom. It's only a matter of how long. How long is it going to take? And if some of us have been on it a little bit, you might say longer, perhaps it's because they've been resisting that cycle that Krishna is referring to in this stanza. To the degree that we resist, that's how long we have to take. Now, one thing we must remember, of course, is the choice is ours. We have, and this is something that God has given each one of us, He has given us free choice. We can take as long or as short as we choose. You could say, you could say that, does that mean that if I choose right now to cast aside delusion, that I'd be free? And Yogananda said, yes, you would be free. But obviously we cannot do that because our mind is hypnotized. But if we could dehypnotize ourselves, you could see, put aside that delusion and see through the curtain of that is obscuring reality, that potential is there right now for each one of us. And sooner or later, it will be our destiny to do that. But the choice is ours, mine and yours. Now, one thing I like about this stanza is when he's saying to him, he says in stanza 17 and 18 that follows, he says, Krishna is saying, for him whose only love is the self, who delights in the self and is content to rest in the self, no duty remains. Such a person has nothing to gain by performing action in this world, nor anything to lose by not performing. He is dependent on no one and nothing outside the self. Now, what Krishna is doing here is he's advising Arjuna. And in other parts of the Gita, there's that famous quote of Krishna's, Arjuna, get away from this ocean of suffering. And even there, what he's doing is he's advising him, and he's not commanding Arjuna to do that. He's advising him as a friend, because he's saying, if you, for your sake, I'm advising you to give up the self, give up that little sense of ego, and make your home in God. And this is Krishna's way. He's offering as advice of a friend. One, for two reasons I see in that is, one, avoid suffering, and the other one is, if you don't, what you're doing only is depriving yourself of something much higher than what you're used to in this world. Why accept the littleness when there's such a beautiful potential right there inside you, but you're resisting that? But you're choosing it. Your free will is choosing to remain in littleness. I see this often. I think of this sometimes when I'm dealing with other people. And what this world is such that you're going to meet people that sometimes don't actually behave very well. They might actually behave quite badly, and maybe to you. And the natural reaction is when somebody behaves badly, perhaps they offend you or insult you or hurt your feelings in some way, or somebody else, and you're watching them do that, the idea or the thought comes into mind to condemn them, to say, why do they behave that way? What's wrong with that person? And you become a little bit angry or resentful. But in time, I've noticed that as you have some taste of the divine yourself, you realize that this person is living in delusion. And from condemnation, I think the natural feeling is to feel compassion for that person. Somebody is, let's say, hurt your feelings, insulted you. It's not normal that you would feel compassion for that person, would it? But if you know that that person is only hurting themselves, they're not hurting you. If you can attain that peace of mind, that calmness, that centeredness in yourself, that you know that they're only hurting themselves, the natural reaction is to feel compassion for them. You feel sorry for them. Think of it as a little child, perhaps there's a 2 or 3 year old, and that 2 or 3 year old gets very angry at you for some reason. Perhaps you've had to make some minor correction or prevent it from hurting itself, and it gets maybe a little temper tantrum. It would be childish of you to get angry. I mean, oh, well, maybe children could do that to us, but for something silly, you wouldn't get angry at them. You'd feel sorry for them. You'd say it's just a child behaving in a childish way. Why do we have a different view when it's an adult? Well, we think well, by this time as an adult, they should know better. But yet, if you know better already and you are unruffled by what they have said or done to you, you feel just naturally, you feel a sense of compassion for that person. And this is how we should be. It says, I think one of the, how we go through life is, and here again, as just to review this, he says, for those who love, whose only love is the self, and who delights in the self, and is content to rest in the self, no duty remains. Such a person has nothing to gain by performing action, or anything to lose by not performing action. Now, people think, if on first reading, you might think, well, then there's nothing to do. I shouldn't act. But remember, go back a few discussions ago, we covered that in the Gita. It's only the person who is free of egos truly can do inaction. As long as we're in the ego, we must act. But if a person truly rests in the self, there is no action. But that doesn't mean that that person doesn't perform in the world, do duties in the world, in order to fulfill certain dharma, in order to act as example for others, and we'll be coming to that in future discussions. We continue, the saint continues to act in this world out of divine necessity or divine dharma, you could say divine duty. And so it doesn't mean that they're only sitting in silence. Now, of course, some saints do. I mean, some saints act in the performance of meditation, for example, but there's no ego involved in that. I think an image that could be used, you reach the point where you become what you might say is a divine actor. Have you ever performed in a play? Most of us, when we go to school, at some point the classroom has some sort of skit or play. And usually most of us somewhere in school time have had an opportunity to be in the play. And even as adults, we sometimes are cast in roles and performances. And this has happened to me, and I've done various roles. And as an actor, when you're playing, you have to take on the personality that the character is, or the playwright who's ever written the play has demanded. And so we sometimes that's the good person, and sometimes it's the villain. We used to do a play of the Mahabharata at Nanda Village in California, and I remember I played Bhishma many times, and I played others as well. And I remember there was one fellow, every year he would play Shakuni. But this fellow was a very jolly person, and Shakuni was a very evil person. This person was completely opposite his normal personality, but he had so much fun every year. He loved to play that because it was opposite of him. And oftentimes you find in plays you put on a personality just for fun, but it's not you. You're totally removed from it. When the act is over, when the play is over, you return, you put it aside. And in a sense, this is how we should behave also in life. Acting in life totally free from any attachment, totally free from any identification with how it is that we're acting in this life. And just be a free soul. This is how we want to be. Now, what's holding us, though, and coming back to the first stanza we read, people resist. Why do they resist this natural cycle? Well, of course, it's because we're attached. We're attached to this body, we're attached to this personality. We think this is who we are, and of course, we've said many times now by this point in our discussions that this is the nature of ego. And what is ego? Once again, and we're probably throughout the Gita, we're going to say this many times, the ego is the soul identified with the body. And it's that we hang on to it. And that's the mystery. Why do we hang on to it? Well, it's familiar. You've probably heard that image of how the bird is locked in a cage for years and years. It's locked in the cage, and finally the cage is opened so the bird could fly out and have the opportunity to go out and be free, but it doesn't. It's afraid. It's been in that cage so long that it resists. Many people shrink back from the prospect of freedom. It's natural. And you'll find this too in your meditation sometimes. There'll be some times when the breath itself wants to stop. Have you ever noticed when you're breathing, if you're practicing techniques, those of you who know techniques of watching the breath, sometimes the breath will become very slow, and all of a sudden the breath will stop for momentary. You'll exhale and it won't come back, and you'll notice it, and all of a sudden you'll go and you'll take a breath like that, because you notice the breath, I'm not breathing, and then you take that breath in. And it's a representation, which the breath is, of ego. The ego notices and immediately it inhales. But in time, even that can be overcome. Well, it's the same with us. We hang on to the ego. We speak about wanting to be expansive, but there's also, if we look very honestly within ourselves, we enjoy being little as well. There was a story of a friend of mine, a lady friend, he's now grown up, of course, but when he was a child, little boy, he was doing something, he was probably, 5 years old or so, 6 years old, and he was doing something very childish, the babyish. And his mother said to him, says, now, don't behave like that. You're a big boy now. And the little boy looked up at his mother and he says, but Mommy, I don't want to be a big boy. And it was very cute. He wanted to remain in that like a little baby and not to have to grow up. And I think you see this in literature, even Peter Pan, for example, the desire for that to be that eternal little boy. And people want to that call to that sweet innocence, a child of being the little child. Well, it's the same thing with us with the ego as well. We know that it must be overcome, but yet we cling to it, we hold on to it. And this is a process of slowly, little by little, we allow it to go, that we allow that if we overcome that feeling, well, if I serve others and give my life in service, what will become of me? Other people, they'll take from me. So there's a fear. Often people say that. They say, why should I be serving others and I should not be serving myself? A lady came to me just a week or two ago, and she was in great desperation because she was caring for her family. And her duty, of course, was to care for not only her parents, but her husband's parents as well. They were all somewhat infirm. And she had many ambitions in life but she found herself overwhelmed. And it come to a point in her life where she just says, I just don't want to serve other people. But then when I asked her close, she says, well, yes, I do want to serve those people, but what about me? What about me? What about my potential, my future? And of course, there's a very heartrending dilemma because she was overwhelmed with work. But yet, for all of us, there's that fear. If I serve others, maybe they're going to take advantage of me. Maybe I won't have the opportunity to fulfill all those desires, perhaps the hopes and ambitions that I have. But we find that actually, if we give up the little self in service, we find that somehow, when done perfectly and in divine consciousness, somehow perfectly, everything begins to flow rightly. And this little bit of ego that's there, that's holding on, that if we can let it go, and let it go in freedom, and just offer ourselves up to God, we find that our freedom lies there. The final, or the next stanza that also concludes this thought that we're exploring today is, therefore, Be conscientious during the performance of all actions, whether physical or spiritual, to act without attachment. By activity with self-interest, one attains the supreme. And so the definition of what does it mean to act spiritually? And spiritual action is to be conscious, to act in the consciousness of God within us, to act in the consciousness that it's God that is acting through us, that God is, there's no sense of I or individual identity remaining within us. There's if we've been addressing the question of why God created this world and why we find ourselves in this dilemma, whether it's ego and why did this ego get created, but perhaps the larger, more useful question is, what do we do about it? Here we are, we find ourselves in this situation, and this is the purpose of why we have yoga. And this is the science of yoga, is the overcoming and the transcendence of this ego. And you could say that the whole of the Bhagavad Gita is a discourse, a scripture on trying to answer that question. This is what makes it such a great scripture, is because it's so efficiently practical. And this is what Krishna, in the whole dialogue, he's saying, Arjuna, get away from this ocean of suffering. Yes, that's what we want to do. But then he goes on and explains why and how we need to do that. We need to give up that ego. There's, it's often said when people take up the spiritual path, devotees, they call to God, and they're wanting God to come to them. It's often the expression of the divine path is often that of the devotee seeking God, the devotee running after God, the devotee doing everything possible in order to transcend this ego and in order to find God. But there's a beautiful poem that I want to read just the first few lines of, that actually expresses this in another way I'd like us to consider. And this is a poem called The Hound of Heaven. I may have mentioned this before in a previous discussion, but it's by Francis Thompson. And it starts off, the first few lines of it says, I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind, and in the midst of tears, I hid from him. Now, isn't that fun, the way to look at it? We often think that the pursuit of God, the pursuit of the divine, the pursuit of even the guru, you could say, is one of us seeking, and climbing. And we've talked about this. It is we have to put out this effort, but the effort isn't so much of our reaching out to God. It's also, or could be also looked at as a matter of fleeing from God. We could say that just in that very first stanza that we read this evening, we resist God, we run from God. And in this poem, of course, God is referred to as a hound that is chasing the deer. And the deer keeps running and running from the hound until finally at the end, the deer gives up and allows the hound to catch him. But he finds that it's a benevolent force that has found him. And so it is for us. The spiritual path could be one of not so much of having to seek God, because that seems to imply effort. It seems to imply a certain amount of tension. I'm seeking, I'm finding. But you could also look at it as to allow God to find us, to stop fleeing from God, to stop running from God, to stop resisting the natural flow of God coming to us. It's said that God has everything. I mean, God is God, so God has everything. He is everything. God has everything, but except for one thing. God doesn't have our love. And to the degree that, and to give God our love is one of not resisting, but one of opening ourselves to allow the divine to come into us. It's said that we have everything we need already, except that blockage that we put out to prevent that from coming into us. As even we know, we've said before that this path of Kriya, or the path of yoga, is one of memory. We know already, but we just don't remember. So if we can remove those things that block God from coming to us, we find that then it becomes easy. We relax into the spiritual path. And I think certainly when we teach Hatha Yoga, physical side of yoga, what is one of the first things we talk about when we do postures? It's not a matter of tension, a matter of trying to stretch ourselves out vigorously with our willpower in order to grab our toes. It's one of learning to relax into that posture, allowing us, as we relax and remove tension, slowly we find ourselves be able to go a little bit further, a little bit further, a little bit further, until finally we remove all tension and we can accomplish the pose. Well, that's a physical image. It's the same thing with devotion. It's the same thing with yoga. It's the same thing with removing blockages. It's the same thing with the yamas, niyamas, removing those things that prevent us from fulfilling that natural cycle, which is our destiny, to be able to relax into God and to allow God to come into our heart. And this is why in Ananda, we have a very beautiful ceremony that we perform from time to time. We invite people to come. They write a little something on a piece of paper, perhaps some difficulty they're having in life or some personal obstruction to their personality they'd like to overcome. Perhaps they're fearful, or perhaps they're a little bit too self-willed or prideful. And whatever it is, they just privately write it on a piece of paper. And then they come up to one of the acharyas, and they kneel before the acharya, and they say the words, "I seek purification by the grace of God." And the acharya says to him, the master says, "Open your heart to me, and I will enter and take charge of your life." And then the acharya prays for the person who has come forward, and then afterwards blesses them, and that person then goes up to the altar and burns that piece of paper in the fire. You could say, in that burning of that paper in the fire, that's yajna. This is a symbolic form of self-offering. And this is what we started with our very first reading. In self-offering and the removal of resistance, we fulfill the natural cycle of this cosmic creation. And this is what we do symbolically in this very simple ceremony. And this is something you too might do when you meditate. When you meditate at night, the natural tendency of the meditator sometimes can be to they're trying so hard to lift their consciousness up with their concentration at the point between the eyebrows. God, you must come to me. Now this is good. This fervor, divine fervor is very good. But there's a story of one of the disciples went to Paramahansa Yogananda, said, "Sir, I'm meditating very hard, long, diligently, with great concentration, but I don't feel I'm getting anywhere." And Master told him, he says, "You're trying too hard. You're trying too hard." You see, it was with a certain amount of tension. And it's a matter not so much of affirmative, tense, you might say, desire for God alone. We also have to simultaneously, if you can think of it both at the same time, relax into that and allow God to come to us. And so when you meditate, feel yourself to be offering yourself. Feel yourself to be removing resistance from allowing God to come into you. Call to God, but then at the same time ask, you might say, that anything that's blocking God coming to you, allow those to be removed. Yajna is a very powerful symbol, sacrifice, but any of the outward sacrifices, which are good, in this case, those pieces of paper, this is a good reminder, but it's the real sacrifice, is that sacrifice of the self. It's self-offering that we really want to give. And so when you meditate with that consciousness of offering oneself up into the divine. Now, before I go further, I wanted to remind you that I've touched on anything that raises a question in your mind, and if you'd like to submit any question, please do so. And as we speak here further, I'll try to answer your questions. You can just write them in, and my technical assistant here will write them on the board for me to see. So I saw something also. We're speaking of as I began, one of the things that calls people to God is we suffer. And something Swami Kriyananda wrote very interestingly, he says, must remember in life that everything in life is a manifestation in bliss. Paramahansa Yogananda said that people seek God for two primary reasons. One is because they want to find happiness in life. And happiness, as you might say, is bliss at a lower octave. Or to avoid suffering. But really, both, even suffering itself is a form of bliss. It's not the opposite of bliss. It's a lower octave of bliss. That in the fact that we suffer shows us, is a demonstration that we have the capacity for bliss. Because you might say that suffering is just the absence of bliss. It's not the opposite of it. It's just the absence of bliss. So that potential of, even you might say, suffering itself, think of it as a gift or something that is being given to you as a way to turn your life or to turn your attention to what will cure that suffering if we're wise, which is ultimately God and bliss. Now I have some questions coming up on the board here which I'd like to answer. And the first one is, are God's 8 aspects only a part of his dream creation, or are they forever? In that question, God's 8 aspects are, don't erase it. He was about to write it, take it away. God's 8 aspects are the 8 aspects of God. God, you might say, is like a diamond. And the diamond has many facets on it. It reflects the light in various ways. And so consequently, God has aspects that we can, experiential aspects. Bliss and joy is one of those aspects. They're love, peace, calmness, light, sound, power, wisdom, love. I think that was 8. These are different aspects of the divine. And those, as long as we have God beyond creation, you could say does not have aspects, because there's an aspect is something like a diamond. There has to be an observer to be able to see and to experience those aspects. And so if there's no other in ultimate reality of the divine beyond creation, you would say there are no aspects. But in creation, when God manifests in creation, there are those aspects of God too. And this is for us as the soul to be able to experience those aspects of God. So in creation, when the soul is manifest, or when the soul has a sense of separation from the divine, it can experience God in one of these 8 ways. And this is something I think each of us have a particular temperament that will attract us to the divine in specific ways. For example, Paramahansa Yogananda said he was attracted to God through the aspect of bliss. That was his nature, to experience God as bliss. Swami Sri Yukteswar, of course, was a saint of wisdom, and he felt that, or he experienced God in that way. And if you look at each of yourself, you'll find that in different ways, and even at different times in your life, you'll feel certain bobs, you might say, toward how to experience God and the divine. Paramahansa Yogananda said, seek God. He says he recommended we seek God through the aspect of joy or bliss in this way, as one of the first primary ways. Or peace would be good and calmness would be good. Many people are attracted to God for love, but he said probably you're better off seeking him through joy rather than love first. He says because we're embodied with this ego, the tendency will be to experience love more a little bit toward emotion side. But if that's your nature, then go with what your nature is. But he said, I seek God for joy, and he recommended that is also something we might want to do. So the answer to is, are God 8 aspects only a part of his dream of creation, or are they forever? Well, also, you might think of them also as forever. It is because in the larger sense, time is even time itself is not a real reality. Everything is forever in that sense. Now, second question, how can we know we're allowing God to act through us? That's a very good question. And how is, I started by saying, or is that perhaps that question was stimulated, is we want to act as if God is the doer. God is acting through us. But remember, how I define that is acting in the sense that it is the self that is acting, not the ego, the higher self. We're in attunement with the higher self, not acting from the ego. So we have to transcend the ego. So how do we know if we're transcended ego? Well, you might ask yourself, if are you calm? Are you acting in a state of calmness? Are you acting with desire, or are you non-attached to the desire? Do you act in a sense of joy? Are you feeling joy in your action? I mentioned this last one. Do you feel joy in your action? Or are you acting in a state of God remembrance? Because joy is an aspect of God. In the autobiography of a yogi, Paramahansa Yogananda says to his guru, Swami Sri Yukteswar, that, sir, I finally understand. When I feel the presence of God, when I feel the presence of divine joy in me and can recall it, divine joy, not a little bit of happiness, remember, divine joy. When I can recall a state of divine transcendental joy in any action, I find myself guided to do the right thing. The right thing is the result of that action, even in the details. And so you know that you're going to be doing, God will be acting through you if you're in the state of that transcendental joy. If you're in the state of something less, there's going to be an element of ego. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't act. You have to act in a state of God consciousness to the best of your ability. And you'll find that you'll be guided to the degree that you're in attunement with God. But to the degree that there's a certain ego motivation in your action, there's going to be a certain amount of expectation for reward. It's true. It's not truly nishkam karma, action without the desire for the results of that action. So there's always a little bit there. But remember, life is directional. All of us, to the degree that we can act in the highest way, that's where we want to go. Right action is that action that takes us towards, in the direction of freedom. And to the degree that we feel that God is acting through us, and we're acting in the consciousness of the divine. So if you don't take joy, let's say the perfect divine calmness. Now, you might ask yourself, what is that? Well, this is why also we meditate. We have to learn to experience these divine states by meditating, and then hold on to those states that we experience in meditation and put them into action. So also, don't separate your meditation life from your state of action. Ideally, you want to have that meditative feeling that you gain from meditation, peace, joy, love, and you want to have that all the time, even in action. But we can't learn to experience those unless we meditate first, to be able to withdraw a little bit from the activities of the world, to be able to feel that inwardly in silence. But then once in silence, we take it out and act that way all the time. Paramahansa Yogananda defined it. He said, first, when he spoke about the different states of samadhi, he said the first state of samadhi is the state of oneness with God, but yet it's in a state of divine ecstasy inwardly, not in action. We withdraw from the world, and we have that sabikalpa samadhi, which is we go within, out in or outside, or removed from outer activity. He said that's the first state of samadhi, and there are various degrees of that. He says, but that's not the end. Ultimately, we want to be able to have that state of samadhi even in action, being able to outwardly carry on our life, our duties, whatever it is outwardly, but yet have that state of divine realization. When we have that, then that's the state of nirvikalpa samadhi, and that's when we have transcended. That's the state of the jivan mukta, to be able to attain that. But remember, that may sound very distant for us in a very exalted state, but remember, that's the potential that each of us, as Kriya Yogis, as meditators, that's the state that each of us should strive to attain in this lifetime. And finally, we have a third question. How can we know we're allowing God to act through us? That was the one we just spoke of. How can we live a life that fuels our meditation practice? Well, now that's a little bit off topic of this evening's Gita, but it's the universal question. How can we live a life that fuels our meditation practice? We have to think of God all the time. Love God. This is when the man came to Master and asked him many philosophical questions, Master simply told the man, love God, love God, love God. So I think we have to live a life, of course we have to live a life that supports our meditation practice, but that's something we have to do step by step by step. Outwardly, we have to, as Paramahansa Yogananda said, we have to be practical in our idealism. Find practical ways to support your meditation practice. So you start at the very basics. You set yourself a routine. You learn your basic meditation practices. You learn of self-discipline to be able to practice meditation regularly. Then you begin to create an environment about yourself, not just physical yes, but social environment that is supportive of your ideals. Try to bring your ideals into manifestation. So you create an environment for yourself, but this outward world will begin to conform with what's inside yourself. And so you have to be able to magnetically begin to attract those situations to yourself, but also try to create that environment socially and physically outside of yourself. But the important part is to think of God as much as you can, to have that aspiration. Now, I may be seeming to say both sides of the argument here. I said we have to relax in God, that to be able to call to God, to want to have God in our lives. And sometimes we express that outwardly and forget the part of opening ourselves to the divine. But yes, we do have to have that outward call as well. It said the greatest, you might say, obstacle for the devotee long term on the spiritual path is to overcome that temptation to become indifferent, to not care. If you want God, if you want the divine, if you want to be one with the divine, that takes a desire in the heart. And to nourish that desire for God, you'll find if you can keep that flame alive and keep that flame burning, somehow you will find the resources outside of yourself to help you conform your outer life to the aspirations of that inner desire. So the outer is less important to some degree of what you do outwardly. This is my belief, that the outward will follow the inward. When the heart calls strongly enough, somehow the outer will follow suit. And you could say this is the guru comes, just to use an example. People look for the guru, they look for the guru outwardly. But if you truly have a desire for God in your heart, the guru will come to God. Sends. First he sends perhaps teachings, books, lessons, discourse, those types of things. But then teachers come, and then finally the guru comes into your life. But it starts with the desire for something higher in yourself. You may not even know what that is. People often are looking for God, but they wouldn't frame the question in that way. But they're wanting truth. This is what attracted Swami Kriyananda. He was looking for truth, and then he realized that truth really was the divine that he was looking for. So aspire. As long as you keep that inspiration strong, you'll find that outwardly you'll naturally be attracted to seek those things that will feed that and conform to that. And then slowly you'll find that your life will begin to conform to an outward life, to your meditation practice. But you have to use your common sense as well. Try to keep it alive and do what you can to support it, but keep the fire alive in your heart. That's where it has to start.